Welcome back to another quick unit guide. This time we're going to be looking at the British Archer, which is a late war self-propelled anti-tank gun. It's essentially a variant of the Valentine infantry tank, hence it's sometimes referred to as the Valentine Archer. By mid-1943, the Valentine had essentially become obsolescent, but Valentines continued to roll out of the factories, partly in order to supply the Soviets via Lend-Lease, and partly due to the difficulties of changing established production lines. Not being able to afford to let this production go to waste, the British did what everyone does when they have a load of obsolescent vehicles and started messing with the design, bolting new and improved gubbins to it so that it could sidestep into other battlefield roles. At the same time, the British were very impressed with their new 17-pounder anti-tank gun and were looking for armoured vehicles that could accommodate it. It didn't take long for them to try and mash the 17-pounder and the Valentine together. The end result was the Archer. In total, 655 were produced between March 1943 and the end of the war, seeing service in northwest Europe and Italy, before being replaced by the British in the early 1950s and sold off, a couple of hundred or so ending up in the Middle East, where some of them took part in the Arab-Israeli wars. Beginning our digital walk around, we're going to start at the front of the Archer, which may not be what you are expecting. The Archer is a very unusual design because the main gun points out the back of the vehicle. We'll get round to that in a minute, but it's really important to bear in mind. The bow then, as it were, is pretty featureless. It's quite tall because it forms part of the armoured casemate for the gun. You can see the crew in there, but the main elements are the two drivers' periscopes at the top centre. Starboard of them on the roof we have an antenna. The Archer has a radio. Then right in the middle we have a small hatch which the driver can open for a better view in safe conditions. Heading around the port side we have the distinctive Valentine bogies with one large and two small wheels each. Above that we've got an exhaust that leads back to the grills and vents on the rear deck that give away the position of the engine. This might seem pretty chunky in comparison to the overall size of the vehicle, but the Archer actually performed really badly in the vehicle mobility test. It got an overall score of 1052, which we can compare to a similar vehicle like the Marder 3M, which got 784. The Archer was distinctly slow, even on the road test, where it was basically a minute slower than the Marder. If we dig into this a bit, the difference is pretty obvious. The Archer is 6 tons heavier, and although it does lose some mobility due to that extra weight, it also gains some advantages over the Marder. A good portion of that extra weight is taken up by the armament. The Archer is armed with the 17-pounder gun and nothing else. This is mounted forward of the engine compartment towards the front of the vehicle, aiming to the rear. This position might seem a little counterintuitive, but it does have some advantages. Firstly, there's not really another place to mount the gun on the Valentine without starting to really mess with the design. A casemate mount like this is infinitely easier to design and produce than a turret big enough to fit the 17-pounder in, and it makes use of the existing driver and fighting compartments. The rearwards facing avoids some balance problems and all the difficulties of having a very long barrel sticking out the front of the vehicle. Tactically speaking, this also really plays into the Archer's intended role as a self-propelled anti-tank gun. The position of the casemate helps keep the overall height down, compared to, for example, mounting it at the other end and having the crew standing on the engine block, and if the vehicle needs to bug out of its firing position, it's already facing the right way and it can just drive off. On the other hand, operating outside of this very specific role, the layout has some flaws. This is not a vehicle you want to be moving to contact with. The reverse speed you'd need to use to keep the gun facing the enemy is too slow to be really useful, and the Archer will obviously struggle to react to any targets that pop up outside of its field of fire. Another disadvantage is that the position of the gun barrel means that it will absorb heat from the engine vents. Having different areas of the barrel heat, and therefore expand at different rates, is not good for accuracy. That's why more modern tanks have thermal shrouds for their gun barrels. I have no idea how significant a difference it might make in a World War II context, but I guess you can always blame inconsistent barrel expansion when your archers miss their targets. Speaking about targets, the 17-pounder is a weapon we've covered before when we looked at the Sherman Firefly. In short, at 1,000 metres the Archer will quite happily punch holes in the turret face and lower front plate of the Panther. Inside 500 meters, it can penetrate the front slope, especially since it may switch from armor-piercing to armor-piercing discard Osamo ammunition. High explosive, as usual, has effects that are less easy to quantify. Overall, the Archer carries a total of 39 rounds, 20 armor-piercing, 4 armor-piercing discarding Sabo, and 15 high explosive. Looking at the model, we have a pretty typical camo pattern on the 17-pounder, which is intended to mask the length of the barrel, because who knows, the enemy might be low on ammo. There's really only one other feature on the casemate front, that's the slot for the gunner's sight on the right there. Obviously the gunner sits behind that. Immediately behind him is the vehicle commander, and on the other side of the gun is the loader. Then, further down and behind them all, facing forwards, we have the driver. When opened up, the commander will stand up and he might actually need to. The Archer has a surprisingly low profile. Obviously he's liable to get shot if he does that, and the front of the casemate is a bit lower than the side and rear, meaning that it's possible for enemy infantry to hit the gun crew with small arms fire. The casemate obviously also lacks a roof, which means that if the enemy can get to an elevated position, they can inflict all kinds of unpleasantness. They probably will need to, though. The Archer retains enough of the Valentine's armour to be effectively small arms proof. 20mm cannons will need to get inside 250 meters in order to start reliably achieving penetrations to the front and rear. 50mm anti-tank guns at the same range will struggle against the hull, but go through the casemate, while shaped charges and everything bigger won't have any problems at all. Tactically speaking, this all puts the Archer into a very specific role, and it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a self-propelled anti-tank gun. It's not going to win any sluggy matches with tanks, but it can lie in wait, put some 17-pounder rounds into its target, and then do one. It can theoretically be used to support infantry with its limited supply of high explosive, but realistically it's got one job and it's designed to get it done in one way. And although this niche role is something that the Archer can be very successful in, it is something of a problem. By the time the Archer entered service and deployed to France and Italy, Allied operations had taken on a much more offensive character, and this really limited the ability for the Archer to perform as intended. Given the range of Allied tanks, tank destroyers and self-propelled guns by the late war period, the Archer is probably the least suited to forward movement. If you want to bring a mobile 17-pounder to the fight, the Achilles or the Firefly are much better options. So that's a quick once-over of the Archer. Really interesting, quirky vehicle, a solid way to get a mobile 17-pounder anti-tank gun, but really at its core too specific a design to be effective out of its intended role. Hope you all enjoyed this video and found it interesting. If you'd like to see these early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon or YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.